Imagine waking up one morning, going about your day, and then being told by a government official that you don't exist anymore. Not missing, not lost, dead, legally, officially, irreversibly dead. Your bank account's frozen, your driver's license invalid, your social security number tied to a death certificate you never knew existed. You stand there breathing, talking, alive in every possible way, but according to the system, you've been gone for months. This is not a dystopian fiction or a bureaucratic nightmare from some far-off country. This happened in America in the 21st century to a man whose only crime was having the wrong name at the wrong time. What you're about to hear is the true story of Donald Miller, Jr., a man who was declared dead by the state of Ohio while he was very much alive, and the unbelievable legal battle that followed when he tried to prove he wasn't a corpse. Our story begins not with Donald Miller, Jr., but with the moment everything collapsed around him without his knowledge. It's 1986, and Donald Miller, Jr. is a father, a husband, and a man struggling under the weight of responsibility he can't seem to carry. He lives in Arcadia, Ohio, a tiny village in Hancock County where everyone knows everyone, where secrets don't stay hidden for long, and where a man's reputation is built on showing up and doing right by his family. Donald is in his late 20s, married with 2 young children who depend on him, but something inside him is breaking. The pressure of providing, the weight of expectations, the feeling of being trapped in a life he's not sure he chose. And then one day, without warning or explanation, Donald Miller Jr. does something that will set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. He leaves. It's not a planned disappearance. There's no note, no final conversation, no last look back at the house where his children sleep. Donald Miller Jr. simply walks away from his life in Arcadia, Ohio, leaving behind his wife Robin, his son, his daughter, and a pile of unpaid child support obligations that will only grow larger with time. In the beginning, Robin believes he'll come back. Maybe he needed space, maybe he's going through something he can't articulate, maybe this is just a temporary break from reality. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, and Donald Miller Jr. does not return. His family hears nothing, his friends know nothing. He has vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. For his wife and children, the absence is a wound that doesn't heal, a question mark where a father and husband used to be. Robin Miller is left to pick up the pieces. She's a single mother now, raising 2 children on her own, and the man who is legally obligated to help support them has disappeared without a trace. The child support payments stop coming because there's no one to make them. The state of Ohio takes notice. In cases like this, where a non-custodial parent abandons their children and vanishes, the legal system has mechanisms in place to track them down, to hold them accountable, to ensure that children don't suffer for their parents' choices. But what happens when the person you're trying to find doesn't want to be found? What happens when someone is so determined to escape their old life that they're willing to become a ghost? For 8 years, Donald Miller Jr. remains gone, untraceable, absent from the lives of everyone who once knew him. And then in 1994, something happens that changes everything. Robin Miller, now going by her maiden name Homan and having spent years struggling to support her children alone, makes a decision. She goes to court, not to find her ex-husband, not to bring him home, but to do something far more permanent, far more final. Robin petitions the Hancock County probate court to have Donald Miller Jr. declared legally dead. It's a procedure that exists for situations exactly like this, when someone has been missing for years with no contact, no sign of life, no indication they're ever coming back. The law allows for a presumption of death after a certain period of absence. Robin presents her case. Donald has been gone for 8 years. No one has heard from him. There's been no communication, no sightings, nothing. The court reviews the evidence, or rather the lack of evidence, and makes its ruling. On October 4, 1994, Donald Miller Jr. is officially declared dead by the state of Ohio. But here's the thing. Donald Miller Jr. is not dead. He's alive, breathing, working, existing in another state, living under his own name, having simply walked away from his old life and started a new one. He didn't fake his death. He didn't assume a false identity. He just left and never came back. And because he never came back, because he cut all ties so completely. His family had no way of knowing he was still out there somewhere. The death ruling isn't based on a body or evidence of foul play. It's based purely on absence, on the legal presumption that someone who has been gone this long, with no contact whatsoever, must be deceased. For Robin, the death certificate brings a kind of closure, a way to move forward, to stop waiting for someone who clearly isn't coming back. It also, crucially, means the child support debt is erased. You can't pursue someone for child support if they're legally dead. Years pass. Donald Miller Jr. continues living his life elsewhere, completely unaware that he's been declared dead. He has no idea that a death certificate exists with his name on it, that in the eyes of Ohio law, he ceased to exist in 1994, that his children grew up believing their father was gone forever. This isn't a man in hiding, constantly looking over his shoulder. This is simply a man who walked away and never looked back, who cut ties so completely that he never learned what happened in his absence. And then, something shifts. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's the kind of regret that comes with age and the realization of what you've lost. Whatever the reason, Donald Miller Jr. decides to come back to Ohio. It's 2005, more than a decade after he was declared dead, and he returns to the place he once called home. At first, there are no problems. Donald moves back to the Arcadia area, reconnects with some people from his past, starts trying to rebuild some form of relationship with his now-adult children. It's awkward, certainly, and there's a lot of hurt and anger to work through, but he's here, he's present, he's trying. And then he needs to do something routine, something millions of Americans do without a second thought. He goes to renew his driver's license. He walks into the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, fills out the paperwork, hands over his documents, and waits. The clerk types his name and social security number into the computer. And the system flags him immediately. According to the state of Ohio's records, Donald Miller Jr. died in 1994. The man standing in front of the clerk, very much alive and asking for a driver's license, is officially deceased. Imagine that moment. Imagine the confusion, the disbelief, the clerk calling over a supervisor, Donald trying to explain that there's been some kind of mistake, that he's clearly not dead because he's standing right here. But the computer doesn't lie, or at least that's what everyone believes. The records are clear. Death certificate issued, case closed. Donald is told he cannot renew his driver's license because you cannot issue a driver's license to a dead person. It's absurd, Kafkaesque, the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that seems like it should be fiction, but is terrifyingly real. Donald leaves without his license, confused and frustrated, but assumes this is something that can be easily fixed. It's just a clerical error, right? Someone made a mistake, entered the wrong information, mixed up files. This kind of thing happens. He'll go to court, show them he's alive, and they'll correct the records. Simple. But it's not simple, not even close. Donald Miller Jr. retains a lawyer and files a motion in Hancock County Probate Court to have his death ruling reversed. The argument is straightforward. He's alive, therefore the death certificate is invalid and should be rescinded. His lawyer presents Donald himself as evidence. Here is the man you declared dead. He's breathing, he's speaking, he exists. What more proof do you need? But the law is not always logical, and legal systems are not designed to be easily reversed once they've made a ruling. The case goes before Judge Alan Davis of Hancock County Probate Court. It's 2013 now, nearly 20 years after the original death ruling. And Donald Miller Jr. is about to learn just how difficult it is to prove you're alive when the law has already decided you're dead. The hearing is unlike anything most legal observers have ever seen. Here is a man, physically present, testifying on his own behalf, and the central question is whether he exists. Donald takes the stand. He tells his story. Yes, he left in 1986. Yes, he was gone for years. Yes, he understands why his wife did what she did, but he's here now, he's alive. And he needs his legal status to reflect reality. His lawyer argues that the death ruling was always incorrect, that it was based on absence rather than evidence of actual death, and that now that Donald has returned, the mistake should be corrected. It seems like an open and shut case. How can a court look at a living human being and refuse to acknowledge his existence? But Judge Davis has a different perspective. The law, he explains, has time limits for challenging court rulings. In Ohio, you have 3 years to appeal a probate court decision. The death ruling was made in 1994. Donald didn't challenge it until 2013. That's 19 years too late. Judge Davis rules that while Donald Miller Jr. may be physically alive, legally speaking, he missed his window. The death certificate stands. The ruling is not about whether Donald is alive or dead in the biological sense. It's about whether the court has the authority to reverse a decision made 2 decades ago when all proper procedures were followed at the time. Donald's absence, his failure to challenge the ruling within the legal time frame, his complete disconnection from his family for so many years. These are the reasons the court gives for refusing to resurrect him on paper. Donald Miller Jr. walks out of the courthouse still legally dead. The man who came back from the grave has been told by the state that he's staying in it. The decision sends shockwaves through the legal community and the media. It's the kind of story that seems too bizarre to be true, and yet here it is, documented in court records, a man declared dead while standing in a courtroom insisting he's alive. News outlets pick up the story. It spreads nationally, then internationally. People are fascinated, horrified, amused, outraged. How can this happen in modern America? How can the legal system prioritize paperwork and deadlines over observable reality? Donald Miller Jr. becomes famous for being the man the government won't let live. His case raises profound questions about the nature of legal personhood, about what happens when bureaucracy and humanity collide, about who decides whether you exist. But for Donald himself, this isn't an abstract philosophical debate. This is his life or lack thereof. Because being legally dead while physically alive has consequences, Donald cannot get a valid driver's license, which means he can't legally drive. He can't work legally because his social security number is flagged as belonging to a deceased person. He can't open bank accounts, can't apply for credit, can't access government services, can't do any of the 1,000 things that require proof of legal existence in modern society. He's a ghost in his own life, present but not accounted for, visible but invisible to the system. His friends and family know he's alive, but the state of Ohio does not officially recognize his existence. It's a special kind of hell to be trapped between worlds, neither fully dead nor fully alive, erased by paperwork you never signed. Donald's lawyer files an appeal, arguing that the lower court's decision is unjust and that exceptions should be made in cases where the person declared dead literally comes back. The appeal works its way through Ohio's court system. Legal scholars weigh in on both sides. Some argue that the law must have limits, that you can't allow people to challenge decades-old rulings whenever they feel like it, that the 3-year deadline exists for good reason. Others argue that this is an extraordinary circumstance, that the entire purpose of a death ruling is to reflect reality, and when reality changes, the ruling should change with it. The media continues to follow the story. Donald Miller Jr. gives interviews, appears on television, becomes the face of bureaucratic absurdity. And through it all, he remains legally dead, waiting for a system that declared his demise to acknowledge his resurrection. But there's another side to this story, one that gets less attention in the media frenzy but is just as important. Remember why Donald was declared dead in the first place. It wasn't just absence. It was absence in the context of abandoned obligations. When Donald left in 1986, he left behind child support payments he never made. Over the years, that debt grew. By the time he was declared dead, he owed tens of thousands of dollars. The death ruling erased that debt. Robin was released from the impossible task of trying to collect money from someone who was gone. The children were freed from the legal and emotional limbo of having a parent who existed on paper but not in life. And now Donald wants to come back. Not just physically, which he's already done, but legally. He wants his existence recognized, but with that recognition comes the resurrection of the debt. This is where the story gets complicated in ways that go beyond bureaucratic error. If the court reverses Donald's death ruling, the child support debt comes back with him. The state could pursue him for the money he never paid, with decades of interest added on. From one perspective, this is justice. A man who abandoned his children and his obligations shouldn't be able to escape consequences by coming back and asking for a do-over. From another perspective, this is a man who has already paid a price for his mistakes, who has spent years unable to function in society, who is trying to make amends with his children even if he can't undo the past. The legal system is caught between competing interests. The interest in correcting obvious errors versus the interest in finality, the rights of the individual versus the rights of those he wronged. The letter of the law versus the spirit of justice. Donald's adult children are brought into the conversation. What do they think about their father's return, about his legal limbo, about the possibility of him being officially recognized as alive? The answers are complicated, as they would be for anyone who grew up believing their father was dead and then discovered he'd been alive all along. There's anger, certainly, at the abandonment, at the years of absence, at the choice he made to walk away. There's confusion about why he came back, what he wants, whether this is about making amends or simply about convenience. And there's a strange sort of grief, because in some ways it's easier to mourn someone who's dead than to reckon with someone who chose to leave. One of Donald's children speaks publicly about the case, expressing mixed feelings about the father who was gone and then returned, about the death ruling and what it meant for their family's healing process. The legal battle drags on. Months turn into years. Donald remains in limbo, legally dead, functionally limited, unable to fully re-enter society. His case becomes a teaching example in law schools, a cautionary tale about the rigidity of bureaucratic systems, a strange footnote in Ohio legal history. Appeals are filed and considered. Arguments are made about due process, about the court's authority to correct errors, about whether the 3-year limit should apply when the person had no knowledge they'd been declared dead. Legal experts point out the paradox. How can you expect someone to appeal a death ruling within 3 years if they don't know they've been declared dead? Donald didn't learn about the ruling until he tried to renew his driver's license, more than a decade after the fact. Is it just to hold him to a deadline he couldn't possibly have met? In 2014, the appellate court issues its decision. They uphold the lower court's ruling. Donald Miller Jr. remains legally dead. The court acknowledges the unusual nature of the case, acknowledges that Donald is physically present and alive, but holds that the law is clear. Probate decisions must be challenged within 3 years, and Donald's return came too late. The court writes that while the situation is sympathetic, they cannot make exceptions to established time limits even in extraordinary circumstances, because to do so would undermine the finality of legal judgments. Donald's lawyer tells the media that they're devastated by the decision, that this is a miscarriage of justice, that a legal technicality has been prioritized over human reality. Donald himself is quoted saying he just wants to exist again, to be recognized, to have the basic rights and responsibilities of citizenship restored. But the story doesn't end there. Because while Ohio considers Donald Miller Jr. legally dead, the federal government does not. Social Security Administration records, which are separate from state probate court rulings, still show Donald as alive. He has a valid Social Security number. He can file federal taxes. He exists in the eyes of the IRS and other federal agencies. This creates a bizarre split reality. Donald is dead in Ohio, but alive in America. He cannot get an Ohio driver's license, but he could potentially get a passport. He cannot legally work in Ohio without complications, but federal employment might be possible. It's a patchwork existence, a life lived in the gaps between different government systems that don't quite talk to each other. A daily navigation of which version of reality applies in which circumstance. And so Donald adapts. He finds ways to survive in the margins, relying on friends and family, doing work that doesn't require official documentation, getting rides from others because he cannot legally drive himself. It's not the life he imagined when he came back to Ohio, but it's the life he has. Some people in his community see him as a victim of bureaucratic overreach, a man trapped by paperwork and rigid legal interpretation. Others see him as someone facing the consequences of his own choices, someone who abandoned his family and now expects the system to accommodate his return without accountability. Both perspectives have merit. The truth, as is often the case, is more complicated than either simple narrative allows. The case raises broader questions that extend far beyond one man's situation. How do we balance the need for finality in legal decisions with the need for flexibility when circumstances change? What happens when the law becomes so rigid that it can't accommodate obvious reality? Who bears the responsibility when someone walks away from their obligations and then returns years later? Should the legal system prioritize protecting those who were harmed by absence, or should it prioritize correcting factual errors regardless of consequences? There are no easy answers. Legal scholars continue to debate the Miller case, using it as an example in discussions about probate law, due process, and the limits of judicial authority. Some argue that Ohio should change its laws to allow for exceptions in cases like this. Others argue that the time limits exist for good reason and that making exceptions would create more problems than it solves. Meanwhile, the child support issue looms in the background. If Donald were to be declared legally alive, what would happen to the debt that was erased by his death ruling? Would he be liable for child support payments that were supposed to have been made decades ago? Would his adult children, who are no longer minors, have any claim to that money? Would the state pursue the debt on their behalf? These questions remain theoretical because the death ruling hasn't been reversed, but they're part of why some people believe the court was reluctant to change its decision. Money complicates everything. The intersection of family law, probate law, and personal responsibility creates a legal knot that's difficult to untangle. Donald's case sits at the center of that knot, a living example of what happens when someone tries to escape their past only to find it waiting for them when they return. There's also the emotional toll on Donald's children to consider. They grew up without a father. They lived through the uncertainty of his disappearance, the eventual acceptance that he was gone, the strange relief and closure that came with the death ruling. And then he came back. Not as a triumphant return, not with apologies and explanations, but as a man who needed something from the system and suddenly reappeared after decades of silence. For his children, now adults with lives and families of their own, Donald's return reopens wounds that had scarred over. Some people who abandon their families never come back. Those families grieve and eventually move on. But what happens when the absent parent returns, not dead but not quite alive either, caught in a legal twilight zone of their own making? The psychological impact of that situation is profound and rarely discussed in the media coverage that focuses on the bizarre legal aspects of the case. Let's step back and look at how this situation came to be. In 1986, Donald Miller Jr. made a choice. He chose to leave his family, to abandon his responsibilities, to walk away from a life he didn't want. That choice had immediate consequences for the people he left behind. A wife who became a single mother, children who grew up without a father, financial hardship, emotional trauma. In 1994, Robin made a choice. She chose to have Donald declared dead, to seek closure, to erase a debt that could never be collected, to move forward with her life. That choice was based on the best information available. Donald had been gone for 8 years with no contact. In 2005, Donald made another choice. He chose to come back to Ohio, to try to reconnect, to resume life in the place he'd left. And in doing so, he discovered that choices have consequences that extend far beyond the moment they're made. Every decision in this story created ripples that affected everyone involved. The legal principle at the heart of this case is called res judicata, which is Latin for a matter judged. It's the principle that once a court has made a final decision on a matter, that decision cannot be relitigated endlessly. There has to be finality, or the legal system would be constantly revisiting every case ever decided. Res judicata is why we have time limits for appeals, why there are deadlines for challenging court rulings, why legal decisions eventually become permanent even if new information comes to light. In most cases, this principle makes sense. It prevents people from shopping for favorable decisions by filing the same case over and over. It allows people to move on with certainty. But the Donald Miller case exposes the limits of this principle. What happens when the matter judged was fundamentally wrong? When the death ruling was made, it was based on a reasonable assumption given the evidence available. But it was still wrong. Donald wasn't dead. Can a legal fiction be allowed to override observable reality simply because too much time has passed? Some legal experts argue that Ohio should have what's called an intrinsic fraud exception. Intrinsic fraud refers to situations where a court ruling was obtained through deception or false information. In Donald's case, there was no fraud in the traditional sense. No one lied to the court. But some lawyers argue that a death ruling made without a body, without evidence of actual death, based solely on absence, should be subject to reversal when the person reappears. Regardless of how much time has passed, the counterargument is that Robin followed all proper legal procedures, that the court acted appropriately given the information available, and that there was no fraud or deception involved. Donald's reappearance doesn't change the fact that the original ruling was legally sound, based on the circumstances at the time. This debate goes to the heart of what we think legal systems are for. Are they about finding truth, or are they about providing stable, predictable resolutions to disputes? As years pass, Donald Miller Jr.'s case fades from national headlines but remains a local story. A strange tale people in Hancock County tell about the man who came back from the dead but couldn't convince the court he was alive. Donald continues to live in the area, navigating the complications of his legal non-existence, dependent on the goodwill of others who know his situation and help him work around it. He's become something of a local legend, a reminder of how bureaucracy can sometimes produce outcomes that defy common sense. People who know him have mixed opinions. Some admire his persistence in trying to reclaim his legal identity. Others think he brought this situation on himself by leaving in the first place and should accept the consequences without complaint. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but truth is slippery in a case where the legal system and observable reality have diverged so completely. There's a philosophical dimension to this story that's worth exploring. What does it mean to exist? Is existence purely biological, or does it require legal recognition? In modern society, we exist through our documentation. Birth certificates, social security numbers, driver's licenses, bank accounts, tax returns. These papers create a shadow version of ourselves that interacts with institutions and systems. Donald Miller Jr. is alive in body but dead in documentation. His shadow self was erased in 1994 and cannot be resurrected. In some ways, he's more real than any of us. He's proven that a person can persist even when all the paperwork says otherwise. But in other ways, he's less real, because he can't fully participate in a society that requires documentation for everything from driving to working to proving your age at a liquor store. He's a living ghost, proof that in the modern world, being alive isn't enough if the system doesn't recognize you. The question of child support continues to complicate any discussion of Donald's case. By some estimates, if the child support debt were to be reinstated with interest, Donald could owe well over $100,000. For a man who has already struggled to maintain employment due to his legal status, this would be a crushing burden. It's easy to say he should pay what he owes, that he shouldn't have abandoned his children in the first place, that financial responsibility is part of parenthood. All of that is true. But it's also true that his children are now adults, that the money wouldn't change what happened in their childhood. That pursuing this debt might satisfy a sense of justice, but wouldn't repair broken relationships or undo past harm. The law often deals in absolutes. You owe or you don't, you're alive or you're dead. But human situations are rarely that simple. Donald's case exists in the messy space where legal obligations, moral responsibility, and practical reality collide. Robin, Donald's ex-wife, has largely stayed out of the public spotlight. She made one statement through her lawyer saying she did what she believed was necessary for her family's survival and closure, and that she stands by her decision to have Donald declared dead. It's hard to judge her for that choice. She was a single mother raising 2 children alone, with a missing ex-husband who had abandoned his responsibilities. The death ruling gave her closure and freed her from the legal complications of being married to someone who had vanished. When Donald reappeared, it must have been shocking, confusing, perhaps even unwelcome. His return disrupted a narrative she'd lived with for decades. In stories like this, we often look for villains and victims, But sometimes everyone is both, making decisions that seem reasonable in the moment but have unforeseen consequences that echo for years. What's remarkable about the Donald Miller case is how it reveals the gaps between different systems of record-keeping. Ohio probate court says he's dead. Social Security says he's alive. The IRS has records of him filing taxes. Credit bureaus may or may not have information on him, depending on when their records were updated. Each system operates independently, with its own rules and timeframes, and they don't always sync up. This creates opportunities for people to fall through the cracks, to exist in some databases but not others, to be simultaneously present and absent depending on which agency you ask. Donald's situation is extreme, but it's not entirely unique. There are people who have been declared dead by mistake and struggled to correct the error. There are people who have lost their Social Security numbers due to clerical errors and spent years fighting to get them back. Donald's case is simply the most dramatic example of what happens when bureaucracy treats people as data points, and data points as more real than people. In 2016, a news follow-up reports that Donald Miller Jr. is still legally dead, still unable to get a valid driver's license in Ohio, still navigating life on the margins. He's given up on the legal fight, at least for now. The appeals have been exhausted, the courts have spoken, and there's no clear path forward. Some advocates have tried to push for legislative change, arguing that Ohio should pass a law specifically allowing for death rulings to be reversed when the person reappears, regardless of time limits. But legislative change is slow, and even if such a law were passed, it might not be retroactive. Donald might remain in limbo indefinitely, a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks disappearing and then coming back is simple. His story has become a weird piece of American legal history, the kind of case that gets referenced in law school classes and late-night comedy shows, absurd and tragic in equal measure. Let's talk about what Donald has lost by being legally dead. Obviously, there's the driver's license, which in America is essential for independence and mobility, especially in rural areas like Hancock County where public transportation is limited. There's employment, because most employers require valid identification and a Social Security number that isn't flagged as deceased. There's access to banking and credit, because financial institutions need to verify your identity and legal status. There's the ability to enter into contracts, to rent an apartment, to buy property, to get married again, to do any of the legal transactions that constitute normal adult life. But beyond the practical losses, there's something more fundamental: dignity. The dignity of being recognized, of having your existence acknowledged, of being able to say, "I am here," and have society confirm rather than deny it. Donald Miller Jr. lost that dignity when he walked away in 1986, but he lost it again, in a different way, when the court refused to resurrect him in 2013. There are broader implications of this case for how we think about identity and documentation in the digital age. We're moving toward a world where everything about us is stored in databases, where our legal existence is increasingly digital, where losing access to those systems can be catastrophic. What happens when the data is wrong? What happens when a clerical error erases you from the system? How do you prove you exist when all the records say you don't? Donald's case is a preview of these questions. As more of our lives migrate online, as more of our identity becomes wrapped up in passwords and database entries, the potential for digital erasure grows. We like to think that reality is objective, that you can't just delete a person with paperwork, but Donald Miller Jr.'s case proves that you can. The map has replaced the territory. The record has become more real than the person it records. Some people have suggested workarounds for Donald's situation. He could move to another state and try to get a driver's license there, assuming Ohio hasn't flagged his Social Security number in a way that would show up in other state systems. He could try to change his name legally, becoming a different person on paper and starting fresh with new documentation. He could try to work under the table, in cash, avoiding any jobs that require official verification. These workarounds highlight how fragile legal identity is, how much of it depends on systems talking to each other and updating consistently. They also highlight the lengths someone might have to go to when they're caught in a bureaucratic, impossible situation. But all of these workarounds require Donald to adapt to the system rather than the system adapting to accommodate reality, which is what critics find so frustrating about the case. Let's return to the human story at the center of all this legal complexity. Donald Miller Jr. was someone's father, someone's husband, someone's son. He made choices that hurt people, choices he likely regrets even if he's never fully articulated that regret publicly. His children grew up without him, and that absence shaped who they became. His return didn't magically fix those years or heal those wounds. Being declared dead didn't make the abandonment worse, and being legally alive again wouldn't make it better. The paperwork is almost beside the point when it comes to the emotional reality of what happened. But the paperwork is the point legally, because the law deals in documents and rulings and time limits, not in feelings and regrets and the messy work of reconciliation. Donald's legal death might be unjust, but it's also a kind of tangible consequence for intangible harms. A way of saying that you can't just walk away and expect everything to be waiting for you when you decide to come back. In some ways, Donald Miller Jr.'s situation is a very old story dressed up in modern bureaucratic clothing. Throughout history, people have disappeared and reappeared. They've gone to war and been presumed dead only to return years later. They've left on journeys and never come home until decades have passed. They've fled bad situations, started new lives, and occasionally circled back to their origins. What's new is the rigidity of modern record-keeping, the difficulty of correcting official documentation once it's been created. In previous eras, a man could leave and return and simply be accepted back into his community without needing a court to verify his existence. But now we live in an age of documentation, where your legal identity is stored in databases and requires official validation. Donald is a man out of time, trying to live an old pattern of disappearance and return in a modern world that has no easy mechanism for acknowledging his resurrection. The media coverage of Donald's case has been fascinating in its own right. When the story first broke, it was treated as a quirky human interest piece, the kind of bizarre legal anomaly that gets shared on social media with comments about how crazy the world has become. But as more details emerged, the coverage split into different narratives. Some outlets focused on the bureaucratic absurdity, painting Donald as a victim of rigid government systems. Others focused on his abandonment of his family, painting him as someone facing consequences he brought upon himself. Still others treated it as a philosophical question about the nature of legal personhood and identity. All of these narratives contain truth, but none of them tell the complete story. The complete story is too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too resistant to simple conclusions to fit neatly into a news segment or social media post. As of the most recent reports, Donald Miller Jr. remains legally dead in Ohio. He's now in his 60s, living on the margins of society, dependent on others for transportation and support, unable to fully participate in the systems that govern modern life. He's given occasional interviews where he expresses frustration with the situation and hope that something might change, though he seems to have accepted that the legal battle is over and he lost. His children are middle-aged now, with lives and families of their own, and whatever relationship they have with Donald is private, beyond the reach of court documents and news articles. The child support debt remains in limbo, erased by death but potentially resurrectable if the death ruling were ever reversed, which seems increasingly unlikely as time passes. Donald's story has become fixed in place, a strange legal fossil that will probably remain unchanged for the rest of his life. But there's one more dimension to this story that's worth considering, what it tells us about second chances. American culture loves stories of redemption, of people who made mistakes and found their way back, of sinners who repented and were welcomed home. But Donald Miller Jr.'s case reveals the limits of that narrative. Some mistakes have permanent consequences, some abandonments can't be undone, some doors once closed can't be reopened. Donald left his family and his responsibilities. He stayed gone for years. When he came back, he discovered that the world had moved on without him, that the legal system had closed his file, that there was no mechanism for simply resuming where he'd left off. Is that justice? Is that cruelty? Is it just the way things work when you step outside of society's rules and then try to step back in? There's no satisfying answer, which is perhaps why the story continues to fascinate people years after it first made headlines. The Donald Miller case has influenced legal discussions in unexpected ways. It's been cited in academic papers about probate law, used as a teaching example in classes about civil procedure, and referenced in arguments about the need for legal reform. Some jurisdictions have looked at Ohio's situation and discussed whether they need clearer procedures for handling cases where people who were declared dead reappear. A few states have considered or passed laws creating exceptions to time limits for challenging death rulings when the person in question is demonstrably alive. So in that sense, Donald's legal limbo has served a purpose. It's revealed a gap in the law, a situation that existing rules don't handle well, and it's prompted discussion about how to fix that gap. Whether those discussions will lead to meaningful change is uncertain, but at least the conversation is happening. Donald Miller Jr. may remain legally dead, but his case is very much alive in legal circles. As we come to the end of this story, it's important to acknowledge what we don't know. We don't know exactly why Donald left in 1986. Was it financial pressure, emotional breakdown, a desire to escape, a moment of weakness that turned into years of absence? We don't know what his life was like during those missing years. Where did he go? What did he do? Did he think about the family he left behind? We don't know what prompted him to come back in 2005. Was it guilt, loneliness, a desire to reconnect, practical needs? We don't know the full extent of his relationship with his children now. Have they forgiven him? Do they want anything to do with him? Is there healing happening, or just awkward obligation? These gaps in the story are important because they remind us that every legal case, every news article, every documentary script is a simplified version of complex human realities that can never be fully captured or understood from the outside. Donald Miller Jr.'s story is ultimately a tragedy without a clear villain or hero. It's a story about choices and consequences, about the gap between human reality and legal fiction, about the difficulty of correcting mistakes once they've been codified into official records. It's a story about abandonment and return, about debt and forgiveness, about what we owe each other, and what happens when those debts go unpaid. It's a story about identity in an age of documentation, about what it means to exist when the system says you don't. Most of all, it's a story about how difficult it is to undo the past, how some departures are permanent even when you physically return, how you can be legally dead while your heart still beats. Donald Miller Jr. walked away from his life in 1986. In 1994, that life was officially ended by court order. In 2005, he came back and discovered that resurrection is harder than death. He stands today as a living ghost, a man erased by paperwork, a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they can simply walk away and then walk back as if nothing has changed. The system that declared Donald dead is the same system that now refuses to acknowledge his life. That system operates on rules and procedures, on time limits and precedents, on the principle that decisions must eventually become final or chaos would reign. But that system is also made up of people. Judges who make rulings, clerks who enter data, lawyers who argue cases, legislators who write laws. And people have the capacity to recognize when rules produce unjust outcomes, when procedures lead to absurd results, when the letter of the law diverges so completely from common sense that something must change. Donald's case is a test of that capacity. So far, the system has failed that test. The rules have been followed, the procedures honored, the precedents respected, and a man stands before the court breathing and speaking and insisting he exists while the state says he does not. That is where we are. That is where Donald Miller Jr. remains, alive but not living, present but not accounted for, a ghost in his own life. What does the future hold for Donald? It's hard to say. He's growing older, still navigating the complications of legal non-existence, still dependent on others for the basic functions of modern life. It's possible that eventually someone in Ohio's government will take up his cause, that a legislator will introduce a bill to fix the loophole that trapped him, that a new court challenge will succeed where previous ones failed. It's also possible that nothing will change, that Donald will live out the rest of his days in this strange limbo, that his death certificate will outlive him. When he eventually dies for real, will the state issue a second death certificate? Will there be some notation that this time it's official, that the paperwork finally matches reality? Or will his biological death simply be a footnote to his legal one, a belated confirmation of what the state already decided decades ago? These are questions without answers, futures that haven't arrived, conclusions that remain unwritten. For his children, Donald's legal status is probably less important than the emotional reckoning of having a father who left and returned. The law can say Donald is dead or alive, but that doesn't change the fact that he was absent during crucial years, that he made choices that hurt them, that his return asked them to process grief and anger and loss all over again in a different way. Perhaps there's a kind of poetry in the legal ruling that keeps Donald officially dead while he walks among the living. Perhaps it reflects an emotional truth that transcends legal technicalities, that the man who left in 1986 did die in some meaningful way, that the person who came back is someone different, someone who can never fully reclaim the identity and relationships he abandoned. Or perhaps that's reading too much into a simple bureaucratic failure, imposing meaning on what is ultimately just a clerical error that couldn't be fixed because of rigid time limits. Let this case stand as a reminder of the power we've given to documentation in modern society. Your birth certificate creates you, your social security number identifies you, your driver's license proves you, your death certificate erases you. These pieces of paper, these database entries, these official records have become more authoritative than physical presence. Donald Miller Jr. learned this lesson the hard way when he stood in a courtroom, undeniably alive, and was told that legally he didn't exist because the paperwork said otherwise. We all live at the intersection of biological reality and legal fiction, of physical presence and documented identity. Most of us never notice that intersection because the two realities align. But for those who fall through the cracks, who end up on the wrong side of a clerical error, who discover that correcting official records is nearly impossible once they're set in stone, the intersection becomes a trap. Donald is trapped there still, a warning to the rest of us about the fragility of legally recognized existence. The story of Donald Miller Jr. also raises questions about how we treat people who have made serious mistakes. He abandoned his family. That's indefensible. He left his children without a father and his wife without a partner, and he failed to meet his financial obligations for years. Those are serious moral failures that deserve consequences. But what consequences? How long should someone pay for mistakes made decades ago? Is legal non-existence a proportional response to abandonment? Should the system show mercy even when the person didn't show mercy to others? These are questions that different people will answer differently based on their values, their experiences, their beliefs about justice and redemption. The law tries to answer these questions with rules and procedures, but rules and procedures can't capture the full complexity of human moral judgment. Sometimes the law punishes. Sometimes it forgives. In Donald's case, whether intentionally or accidentally, it has done something stranger. It has erased. In the end, Donald Miller Jr. is not the first person to be declared dead while alive, nor will he be the last. There have been others throughout history who faced similar situations. Veterans returning from wars they were presumed not to have survived. Missing persons reappearing after years of absence. Victims of clerical errors who had to fight to prove their existence. What makes Donald's case noteworthy is not its uniqueness, but its clarity, the starkness with which it illustrates the tension between legal systems and human reality. It's a perfect case study because the absurdity is so obvious. A man stands before a judge, clearly alive, and is told he's legally dead. Strip away all the context about child support and abandonment and time limits, and you're left with that core absurdity, that fundamental failure of the system to adapt to changed circumstances. Whether that failure is justified by legal principles or condemned as bureaucratic rigidity depends on your perspective. Both perspectives have merit. Both are true in their own way. As we close this investigation into one man's legal death and actual life, consider what this story reveals about the society we've built. We've created systems that are efficient, standardized, capable of managing millions of people's information with remarkable accuracy. But those same systems lack flexibility, lack the ability to handle exceptional cases, lack the human judgment to recognize when rules should bend. We've prioritized consistency and finality over adaptability and common sense. We've made documentation more powerful than presence. And in doing so, we've created situations like Donald Miller Jr.'s, where a living man is told he's dead, and there's no mechanism to correct the error because too much time has passed. Every person in those crowds exists in two ways, biologically and bureaucratically. For most, these two existences align seamlessly. For a few, they diverge. And when they diverge, the bureaucratic often wins, because the system runs on paper and data, not on flesh and blood. So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway from the strange, sad, absurd story of Donald Miller Jr.? Perhaps it's this. Our choices echo farther than we imagine, and our absences shape the world as much as our presences. Donald chose to leave, and that choice created ripples that continue to affect everyone involved decades later. Robin chose to have him declared dead, and that choice created a legal reality that couldn't be undone. The courts chose to follow established procedures and time limits, and that choice trapped Donald in a paradox of living death. Every decision made sense in its moment, given the information and pressures of that time. But decisions accumulate, harden into permanence, and become very difficult to reverse. We like to think we can always go back, always make amends, always correct our mistakes. Donald Miller Jr.'s story is a stark reminder that sometimes we can't. Sometimes the door closes behind us. Sometimes we become ghosts in our own lives, haunting the edges of a world that has officially declared us gone. For Donald, the story isn't over. He continues to live in Hancock County, Ohio, aging, managing his strange half-existence as best he can. Perhaps he's made peace with his situation. Perhaps he continues to fight it in small ways, looking for new legal angles or hoping for legislative change. Perhaps his relationship with his children has found some stable ground, some way of coexisting with the past without being destroyed by it. We don't know, and we may never know, because the cameras have moved on, the reporters have found other stories. And Donald has been left to live his life as privately as someone in his situation can manage. His case remains in law books and court records, a footnote in legal history, a cautionary tale, a source of debate in classrooms and online forums. But for Donald himself, it's simply his life. Strange, difficult, limited by circumstances both of his own making and beyond his control. Thank you for joining us on this investigation into one of the strangest legal cases in modern American history. The story of Donald Miller Jr. is a reminder that truth is often stranger than fiction, that the systems we create to organize society can sometimes trap us in absurd situations, and that the gap between legal reality and human reality can be vast and difficult to bridge. It's a story without a satisfying ending, without clear heroes or villains, without the kind of resolution we expect from stories. But that's life. That's reality. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't resolve neatly, that leave us with questions rather than answers. That force us to think about the systems we've created and whether they serve us as well as they should. Donald Miller Jr. is alive. The state of Ohio disagrees. And somewhere in that disagreement lies a truth about modern existence that we all should consider before we trust too completely in documentation, in bureaucracy, in the official records that claim to define who we are. Before you go, let me leave you with another story waiting to be told. There's a case out of California, a woman who disappeared from her family's home during a dinner party, vanishing without a trace while guests were in the next room. 20 years later, someone matching her description was found living under a different name just 3 towns away, claiming to have no memory of her past life. The family says she's their missing daughter. She says they're strangers. DNA evidence exists but has never been tested. Why? That's a story for another time. This has been vanished and found. Stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, sometimes the people we're looking for are hiding in plain sight, living lives we can't imagine, trapped between who they were and who they've become.